You need to move a boulder, a big one, maybe 5 tons, maybe 10, sitting in the middle of a flat plain, and you need it somewhere else. You have rope, you have logs, you have 50 people, and every one of them is pulling as hard as they can. And the boulder is barely moving, because the entire bottom surface of that rock is grinding against the ground, and friction is eating almost everything you throw at it. You cannot make the boulder lighter. You cannot make the ground smoother. You cannot add more people, because you do not have more people. What you need is a way to change the physics, a way to take all of that dragging, grinding, scraping resistance and reduce it by a factor of 1,000. And the solution to that problem, when someone finally figured it out, was so simple that it seems like it should have been obvious. A round thing that turns, that is it. A circle on an axle. And that invention, that one deceptively simple idea, arrived so late in human history that by the time somebody built the first wheel, we had already been making boats for at least 60,000 years, shooting arrows for 64,000, farming for 5,000, and firing pottery for longer than that. The wheel showed up after almost everything else. And the reason it took so long is the reason this story is worth telling, because the wheel is not the simple invention you think it is. It is one of the hardest things humans ever figured out. And it started with a problem that nobody alive today would recognize. Before the wheel, people moved heavy things the only way they could. They dragged them. If you needed to get a load of grain from your field to your village 3,000 years before the first wheel existed, you put it on a sledge, basically a flat wooden platform on runners, strapped it to a pair of oxen, and pulled it across the ground. And it worked. Barely. Sledges have been found at sites across northern Europe dating back to at least 7,000 BCE. They worked on snow, they worked on wet grass, they even worked on dry ground if you greased the runners with animal fat. But the friction was enormous. The energy your oxen burned dragging a loaded sledge across open ground was staggering. Most of the force they generated went straight into heating up the contact surface between the sledge and the dirt, rather than actually moving the load forward. For roughly 4,000 or 5,000 years of settled agriculture, that was the best anybody had. Drag it, grease it, pull harder. And here's the connection to the wheel that makes this worth understanding. The entire history of the wheel is a history of fighting friction. Every single improvement, from the first solid wooden disc to the pneumatic tire on your car, is a refinement of the same basic insight. Rolling friction is roughly 1,000 times lower than sliding friction. The wheel did not make loads lighter, it made the ground irrelevant. So who built the first one? This is where it gets complicated, because wheels are made of wood, and wood rots, and almost nothing made of wood survives more than a few thousand years in the ground. The oldest physical wheel ever found was pulled out of a marsh in Slovenia in 2002. A team led by archaeologist Anton Velusek at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences unearthed it at the Ljubljana marshes, about 20 kilometers south of Ljubljana radiocarbon. Dating placed it at roughly 3550 BCE. That makes it about 5,200 years old. The wheel is made of ash wood, 72 centimeters in diameter, with a square hole cut through the center for a square axle made of oak. The axle was found right next to it. And the whole assembly, wheel and axle together, clearly functioned as a unit. Both rotated together. This is not a decorative object. This is not a toy. This is a piece of working transportation technology, built by people who had already figured out the engineering tolerances needed to make it function. But here's the thing. The Ljubljana wheel is the oldest surviving wheel. It is almost certainly not the oldest wheel ever built. We know this because other evidence predates it by several centuries. At a site called Bronices in southern Poland, archaeologists Sarunas Milisoskas and Janusz Kruk found a ceramic pot from the funnel beaker culture dating to roughly 3500 BCE. Scratched into the surface of that pot is what appears to be a drawing of a four-wheeled wagon, if they are right. And the image has been debated extensively since they published it in the Journal of Indo-European Studies in 1982. Then somebody was sketching wheeled vehicles on their pottery a full 400 years before the oldest surviving wheel was made. And at Flintbeck in northern Germany, archaeologist Eric Zeek documented wheel ruts, actual track impressions pressed into the ground by a wheeled vehicle, sealed beneath a megalithic tomb dating to roughly 3400 BCE. Those ruts had to have been made before the tomb was built on top of them. So, by 3400 BCE, somebody in northern Germany was driving a wheeled vehicle across the landscape with enough regularity to leave permanent marks in the ground. This was not a first attempt, this was routine use, which means the actual first wheel is older still, and probably by a significant margin. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the earliest evidence for wheeled vehicles shows up almost simultaneously across a massive geographical area. Mesopotamia, the Pontic Caspian steppe, Central Europe, the Caucasus, all within a few centuries of each other. David Anthony, an anthropologist at Hartwick College who wrote The Horse, the Wheel, and Language in 2007, has argued that this near-simultaneous appearance makes far more sense as the rapid spread of a single invention through existing contact networks than as multiple groups of people independently figuring out the same extremely difficult technology at roughly the same time. His argument is based partly on linguistics. The fact that nearly all Indo-European languages share a common root word for wheel and axle suggests the technology existed before those languages split apart, which places it squarely in the period when Proto-Indo-European speakers were still a single community, probably on the Pontic-Caspian steppe between roughly 3500 and 3000 BCE. Stuart Piggott, a British archaeologist who wrote The Earliest Wheeled Transport in 1983, reached a similar conclusion through a different route, tracing the physical similarities between early European and Near Eastern wagon designs and arguing that they were too close in structure to have been invented independently. Somebody built the first wheel, and then the idea moved faster than almost any technology that came before it, spreading across thousands of kilometers within just a few centuries, because once you saw a wheeled vehicle work, you understood immediately what it could do for you. Now, here's the question that puzzles historians more than almost anything else about the wheel. Why did it take so long? Think about the timeline. Humans controlled fire at least 400,000 years ago. We built boats that crossed 60 kilometers of open ocean 65,000 years ago. We invented the bow and arrow, a device that stores energy in bent wood and releases it on command 64,000 years ago. We domesticated plants and animals starting around 10,000 BCE. We were firing clay pottery by 20,000 BCE in some parts of the world. We built cities, and then roughly 3,500 BCE, somebody finally built a wheel. Why? The answer is not that ancient people were slow. The answer is that the wheel is a genuinely strange invention, and the real obstacle was not the round part. The real obstacle was the axle. Think about what a wheel actually requires to work. A round disc by itself does nothing useful. A log rolls, sure, but you cannot attach a load to a rolling log. The moment you try to connect a platform to a rolling cylinder, you need an axle, a shaft running through the center of the wheel that connects the spinning part to the non-spinning part. And that axle has to solve a problem that is far harder than it looks. There are two basic designs. In the first, the axle is fixed to the vehicle body and the wheels spin freely on the axle ends. This requires extremely precise tolerances. The hole in the wheel has to be slightly larger than the axle end, enough to allow free rotation, but not so much larger that the wheel wobbles sideways and eventually shears off or jams. Too tight, and friction locks the wheel to the axle and the whole thing grinds to a halt. Too loose, and the wheel wobbles, catches, and breaks. The gap between the wheel bore and the axle has to be just right. And making a truly round hole in a truly round peg without a lathe, without metal tools, using nothing but stone and bone and wood is remarkably difficult. In the second design, the wheel is locked to the axle, and the whole assembly spins together inside brackets attached to the vehicle body. This is what the Ljubljana wheel used, simpler to build, but it means both wheels on the same axle have to turn at the same speed, which makes cornering almost impossible. You just have to accept that the vehicle goes more or less straight. Both designs require woodworking precision that goes well beyond anything a casual tinker could achieve in an afternoon. Richard Bulliett, a historian at Columbia University who wrote an entire book about this called The Wheel, Inventions and Reinventions, published in 2016, argues that the engineering tolerances required for a functional wheel and axle system were only achievable by communities that had already developed sophisticated carpentry traditions over centuries, probably through boat building and house construction. The wheel was not built by the first person who noticed that round things roll. It was built by a woodworker whose grandparents and great-grandparents had been refining joinery techniques for generations, someone who had inherited enough accumulated knowledge to make a round hole, a round shaft, and a functional bearing surface, all from wood, all without metal. That is not simple. That is a cognitive and technical threshold that took thousands of years of accumulated skill to cross. And there is another reason the wheel arrived so late. It has no natural model. A biologist named Michael LaBarbera at the University of Chicago published a paper in 1983 in the American Naturalist titled Why the Wheels Won't Go, and his argument is simple and elegant. There is no wheel in nature, no animal, no plant, no organism of any kind uses a true wheel and axle system. The closest thing is the bacterial flagellum, a microscopic molecular motor that rotates, but nobody in 3500 BCE was looking at bacteria. Everything else in the living world moves by legs, fins, wings, or muscular contraction. The wheel has no biological analog because it requires a freely spinning component completely detached from the main body, which would sever any blood supply or nerve connection. Evolution cannot produce a wheel. It is biomechanically impossible, and that means nobody ever saw a wheel in action before somebody built one. Every other major invention has a natural model to copy from. Boats come from watching logs float. Shelters come from watching animals build dens and nests. Cutting tools come from sharp rocks and thorns. The wheel came from nowhere. Someone had to imagine it from scratch, with no example anywhere in the living world to point to. That is genuinely extraordinary. Now, here's something that complicates the story further. While nobody was building wheeled vehicles before roughly 3500 BCE, somebody was making wheels spin much earlier than that. The potter's wheel. Slow-turning pottery platforms called turnettes show up in Mesopotamia as early as 4500 BCE, a full 1,000 years before the first clear evidence of wheeled transport. These early devices were rotating tables that a potter turned slowly by hand while coiling clay upward to shape a vessel. They spun on a vertical axis, they used rotational motion, but they are fundamentally different from a transport wheel, which spins on a horizontal axis under load. Some scholars have asked whether the potter's wheel inspired the transport wheel. The short answer is probably not, or at least not directly. The physics are different. The engineering challenges are different. A potter's wheel needs momentum and smooth rotation. A transport wheel needs to bear weight, resist lateral forces, and survive the shock of uneven ground. They likely emerged from the same broad period of increasing technological sophistication rather than one directly spawning the other. So what happened once the wheel existed? Humans did what humans always do. They made it better and better and terrifyingly better. For the first several centuries, wheels were solid. 3 heavy wooden planks pegged together into a rough circle, sometimes weighing 30 to 50 kilograms each. A single wheel, just one. And a typical 2-wheeled cart had 2 of them plus an axle, meaning the rolling gear alone could weigh close to 100 kilograms before you put a single grain of wheat on the platform above it. Your oxen were hauling the cart as much as they were hauling the cargo, and the construction of those early solid wheels tells you something about the people who built them. You could not just slice a round disc off the end of a tree trunk, because wood split along its grain would crack apart under load almost immediately. Instead, you took 3 separate planks, cut them to shape, drilled holes through them, and pegged them together with wooden dowels, sometimes reinforced with crossbars on the back. Then you had to shape the whole assembly into a circle, smooth the outer rim so it would roll evenly, and bore a hole through the center precise enough to fit the axle, and you had to lubricate the axle. Early wheelwrights smeared animal fat, tallow, or sometimes birch tar on the contact surfaces to reduce friction. Without lubrication, the wood ground against wood, heated up, swelled, and seized. Think about that for a second. The wheel, humanity's great friction-reducing invention, itself required a solution to friction just to function at all. Vehicles using solid wheels were slow, heavy, and suitable for hauling loads at the pace of walking cattle. Practical, but limited. The Yamnaya culture on the Pontic-Caspian steppe buried their dead in kurgans, great earthen mounds, and inside those mounds archaeologists have found the remains of wooden carts with solid wheels dating to roughly 30,100 to 2600 BCE. These were the vehicles of a herding society that moved across vast grasslands with their cattle, and the carts carried their tents, their belongings, and sometimes their dead. For roughly 1,500 years, that was the state of the art. A heavy wooden box on heavy wooden circles, pulled by heavy animals, moving at roughly the speed of a person walking. It was better than dragging a sledge. It was not fast. And then around 2000 BCE on the Pontic-Caspian steppe near the Ural Mountains, someone changed everything. They built a wheel with spokes. The Sintashta culture, named after an archaeological site excavated by Gennady Zdanovich at Chelyabinsk State University, starting in the 1970s, produced the oldest known spoked wheels. They were found in burial pits alongside the remains of 2-wheeled chariots. The wheels had 8 to 12 spokes, and they weighed roughly 1/5 of a comparable solid wheel. Think about what that means for the story of the wheel. For 1,500 years, the wheel had been a heavy, lumbering thing attached to slow ox carts. The spoked wheel transformed it into something light, fast, and lethal. Because the Sintashta people paired those lightweight spoked wheels with something else they had, domesticated horses, and the result was the chariot. The chariot was the first fast military platform in human history. Before the chariot, armies moved at the speed of marching infantry, 3 to 4 kilometers per hour. After the chariot, a warrior with a bow could race across a battlefield at 30 or 40 kilometers per hour, fire arrows from a moving platform, wheel around, and attack from an entirely different direction before the infantry even turned around. The psychological impact alone was staggering. Imagine you're an infantryman somewhere in the Bronze Age, standing in a line with your spear and shield. And over the horizon come dozens of lightweight wooden platforms, moving faster than anything you have ever seen, each carrying an archer who can kill you from 100 meters away while you stand there unable to reach him. You cannot outrun it. You cannot catch it. You can only stand there and hope they miss. Within a few centuries of its invention on the steppe, the chariot had spread across the known world. The Hittites brought it to Anatolia. The Hyksos introduced it to Egypt around 1650 BCE, and the Egyptians, after initially being devastated by it, adopted and refined the design into something lighter and faster than the original. The Mycenaean Greeks were using chariots by 1600 BCE, as depicted on the grave stelae at Mycenae. The Shang dynasty in China had chariot burials at their capital Yingshu by 1200 BCE. The chariots almost certainly transmitted across Central Asia through trade networks. The Rig Veda, composed in India between roughly 1500 and 1200 BCE, is full of references to chariots in warfare, calling them Ratha. The chariot created a new military aristocracy wherever it went. The vehicles were expensive. The horses required specialized breeding and training. The warriors needed years of practice to fire a bow accurately from a bouncing, lurching platform at full gallop. This was not a peasant's weapon. This was the weapon of kings and their closest soldiers, and it reshaped the social hierarchies of every civilization that adopted it. The Battle of Kadesh in approximately 1274 BCE fought between the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, involved an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 chariots between both sides. That is the largest chariot battle in recorded history, and every single one of those chariots was built on the same basic principle that someone in Slovenia or Mesopotamia had figured out roughly 2,000 years earlier. A round thing that turns on a shaft. The scale had changed, the speed had changed, the killing power had changed, the principle had not. The chariot eventually became obsolete, replaced by mounted cavalry starting around 900 to 700 BCE. Once riders learned to fight effectively from horseback without needing a platform beneath them. But the wheel did not disappear with the chariot. It just moved into new roles: heavier war wagons, supply carts, trade vehicles, and eventually the road networks that empires built specifically to accommodate wheeled traffic. The Roman road system, roughly 400,000 kilometers at its peak, was engineered in large part to allow wheeled vehicles to move troops and supplies across the empire. The wheel did not just benefit from roads, it demanded them. And then there are the places where the wheel never arrived at all. And these are just as important to the story. The entire pre-Columbian Americas had no wheeled vehicles. None. The Maya built cities with populations of over 100,000. The Aztecs built Tenochtitlan, one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. The Inca built over 30,000 kilometers of roads, the Hapag-Nan system stretching the entire length of South America. And none of them had wheels. Here's the part that should genuinely puzzle you. The Aztecs had wheeled toys, small ceramic animal figurines with functional wheel and axle assemblies on their legs, found at sites in Veracruz and Oaxaca, dating to roughly 1500 to 500 BCE. Someone in Mesoamerica understood the principle. They built working miniature versions of it, and they never scaled it up, almost certainly because there was nothing to pull a full-size cart. The Americas had no horses. Horses had gone extinct in the Americas roughly 10,000 years ago. There were no cattle, no donkeys, no draft animals of any kind in North or Central America. The only large domesticated animal in South America was the llama, which is a pack animal with a skeletal structure unsuited to pulling. Without a draft animal, a wheeled cart is just a box you have to push yourself, and pushing a loaded cart on unpaved ground with no roads is barely better than carrying the load on your back. The wheel is not just a wheel, it is a system. And without every part of that system, draft animals, reasonably flat paths, carpentry skills for the axle, lubrication for the bearing surface, it does not work. The Inca ran a continent-spanning empire with relay runners and llama caravans and never needed a wheel to do it. The same pattern holds in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Tisates fly belt across Central Africa killed draft animals with trypanosomiasis, sleeping sickness, making animal-drawn vehicles impractical across vast stretches of the continent. And in Australia, where Aboriginal Australians had no draft animals and no need for wheeled transport in a nomadic lifestyle covering some of the roughest terrain on Earth. The wheel, in other words, is not inevitable. It is not something that every sufficiently smart civilization automatically invents. It is a solution that only works when a very specific set of preconditions are met. Flat terrain, draft animals, sophisticated woodworking, and a settled population that needs to move heavy loads between fixed points on a regular basis. Without all of those, the wheel is not just unnecessary. It is useless, but where it did take hold, it did not stop at transport. The wheel turned into something much bigger than anyone who built the first one could have imagined. Once humans understood rotational motion, they started seeing it everywhere. The water wheel appeared by the 3rd century BCE in the eastern Mediterranean. A wheel turned by a flowing river, converting the kinetic energy of water into mechanical power to grind grain. Think about what that represents in the story of the wheel. For roughly 3,000 years, the wheel had been a passive thing. You pushed it, animals pulled it, the energy came from muscle. The water wheel flipped that relationship. Now the wheel was capturing energy from the environment and doing work that no human or animal was performing. The Roman engineer Vitruvius described vertical water wheels in his De Architectura around 25 BCE, and by the medieval period, water wheels were powering grain mills, sawmills, fulling mills, and forges across Europe. The same idea behind the water wheel would eventually produce the windmill, the turbine, and eventually the electrical generator. Gears are wheels with teeth. The oldest known geared mechanism is the Antikythera mechanism, a Greek astronomical calculator recovered from a shipwreck in 1901, dating to roughly 100 BCE. Gears translate rotational motion between shafts, allowing changes in speed, direction, and force. Without gears, there are no clocks. Without clocks, there is no precise timekeeping. Without precise timekeeping, there is no age of navigation, no industrial revolution, no modern world. And every single gear, no matter how complex the mechanism it sits inside, is a wheel. The concept has not changed, only the application has. A pulley is a wheel with a groove for a rope. Compound pulleys allow a single person to lift loads many times their own weight. Ancient Greek and Roman construction depended on them. The Colosseum was built using crane systems powered by pulleys. A flywheel is a heavy wheel that stores rotational energy. The potter's wheel was an early flywheel. The spinning wheel, which reached Europe from India or the Islamic world in the 13th century, applied the same concept to textile production and multiplied thread output by an order of magnitude. And the steam engine, the machine that launched the Industrial Revolution, uses a crankshaft and flywheel to convert the linear motion of a piston into the rotational motion that drives everything else. Every factory, every locomotive, every electrical generator, every car engine on Earth is a descendant of the same basic concept. A round thing that turns one more thing. The word wheel comes from the Proto-Indo-European root kweklo, which is itself a reduplicated form of quell, meaning to turn or to move around. The word has been traced by linguists, including David Anthony in The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, across nearly every branch of the Indo-European language family: Old English huiol, Old Norse hol, Sanskrit kakra, Greek kyklos, Latin cyclus. The fact that nearly all Indo-European languages share a common root for wheel is itself evidence that the technology existed before those languages diverged from a common ancestor, placing the invention firmly in the period when speakers of Proto-Indo-European were still a single community on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, roughly 3,500 to 3000 BCE. The word for the wheel is as old as the wheel itself. We named it before we scattered across the planet, and we carried the name wherever we went. Right now, the wheels of a commercial aircraft are retracting after takeoff at several hundred kilometers per hour. A potter in Japan is centering clay on a wheel that spins at 200 revolutions per minute. A child somewhere is pushing a toy car across a kitchen floor, and all of them are using the same principle that somebody roughly 5,500 years ago figured out by making a round piece of wood turn on a shaft. It was not inspired by anything in nature. It was not an obvious idea. It required generations of accumulated woodworking skill, the right animals, the right terrain, and the right conditions to be worth building at all. And most of the world never built one, because for most of the world it was never worth building. But the places that did build it, the places where the conditions lined up, and the carpentry was good enough, and the animals were strong enough, those places used a round piece of wood and a shaft to reshape the surface of the earth. The wheel is not one of humanity's earliest inventions. It is one of the latest, and it might be the most consequential thing we ever built from scratch.